You think medieval princesses lived fairy tale lives of comfort and luxury? Tomorrow, you could wake up in a world where speaking the wrong truth could cost you your tongue, where royal blood meant nothing against the machinery of political vengeance, and where a single secret could transform a beloved princess into a voiceless victim. Medieval royal courts weren't Disney castles. They were death traps where knowledge was more dangerous than any sword, and silence was the only currency that could save your life. What I'm about to tell you isn't some romanticized tale of courtly love and chivalry. This is the documented horror of Princess Philomela of Thrace, whose story reveals the brutal reality of medieval power structures that would make modern political scandals look like playground disputes. We're diving into a world where royal protection meant nothing, where family bonds dissolved under political pressure, and where the most powerful weapon wasn't a blade but information itself. In 1347, the courts of medieval Europe operated under rules so savage they'd horrify modern sensibilities. Kings didn't just rule through divine right. They maintained power through systematic terror that made loyalty a matter of survival rather than choice. What happened to Princess Philomela exposes the nightmarish reality of medieval justice, where even royal blood couldn't protect you from the consequences of speaking truth to power. Here's what most people don't realize about medieval royal courts. They weren't governed by law as we understand it today. They were governed by fear, manipulation, and the constant threat of violence against anyone who threatened the established order. A princess who witnessed the wrong thing, who learned the wrong secret, who spoke the wrong truth, could find herself transformed from beloved royal family member into political liability faster than you could blink. But Princess Philomela's story isn't just about medieval brutality. It's about how power structures throughout history have silenced those who threaten them, how knowledge becomes dangerous when it challenges authority, and how even the most privileged positions offer no protection against systematic oppression. The methods may have evolved, but the impulse to silence inconvenient truths remains disturbingly constant. Before we dive into the horrifying details of what happened to Princess Philomela, I need to set the stage for you. Because understanding her fate requires understanding the world she lived in. A world where royal marriages were business transactions, where family loyalty meant nothing against political necessity, and where a single witnessed conversation could seal your doom. The year was 1347, and Europe was a powder keg of competing kingdoms, shifting alliances, and brutal power struggles. The Black Death was beginning its devastating sweep across the continent, but political machinations were already claiming victims in ways that would make the plague look merciful by comparison. Royal courts weren't safe havens of civilization. They were sophisticated torture chambers where psychological warfare replaced physical violence, and where the cruelest punishments were reserved for those who dared to speak truth. Princess Philomela of Thrace was born into this nightmare, though she wouldn't understand its true nature until it was far too late. At 17 years old, she possessed everything medieval society claimed to value in a woman. Beauty that inspired poets, intelligence that impressed scholars, and most dangerously of all, a sense of moral duty that would ultimately destroy her. She believed, as many young idealists do, that truth and justice would prevail if only someone was brave enough to speak them. How wrong she was. The political landscape of 1347 Thrace was a chess game played with human lives, where every marriage was a strategic alliance, every friendship a potential betrayal, and every secret a weapon waiting to be deployed. King Thrace ruled through a combination of military might and psychological manipulation that would make modern dictators envious. His court was a carefully orchestrated performance where loyalty was performed rather than felt, where smiles masked murderous intent, and where the wrong word whispered to the wrong person could trigger consequences that rippled through generations. Into this toxic environment came Princess Philomela, raised in relative isolation by tutors who had filled her head with noble ideals about justice, truth, and the responsibilities of royalty. Her education had prepared her for many things: politics, languages, music, literature, the arts of courtly conversation. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of a court where knowledge was currency and silence was survival. The marriage alliance that brought Philomela to King Thrace's court seemed, on the surface, like a typical medieval political arrangement. Her sister Procne had already married the king, cementing an alliance between their kingdoms that promised peace and prosperity for both realms. Philomela's arrival was meant to strengthen these bonds further, to serve as a living symbol of the unity between the two royal houses. But medieval marriage alliances were never just about unity. They were about control, leverage, and the careful management of information that could make or break kingdoms. Every royal bride brought with her not just a dowry and bloodline, but access to secrets, knowledge of her home kingdom's vulnerabilities, and insight into political machinations that could prove invaluable to enemies. King Thrace understood this better than most. His rise to power hadn't come through noble birth or divine mandate, but through a calculating intelligence that could identify weakness and exploit it with surgical precision. He collected secrets the way other kings collected taxes, understanding that information was the most valuable currency in medieval politics. And Princess Philomela, innocent and idealistic as she was, represented both an opportunity and a threat. The first signs of danger came within weeks of Philomela's arrival at court. The whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, the servants who avoided her eyes, the way certain nobles would study her face when they thought she wasn't looking, as if trying to read her thoughts. Most unsettling of all was the behavior of her sister Procne, who had once been warm and affectionate but now seemed distant, almost fearful. What Philomela didn't understand was that she had walked into the middle of a conspiracy that had been brewing for months. King Thrace, despite his outward appearance of strength and stability, was facing challenges that threatened to topple his reign. Rival claimants to his throne were gathering support. His military campaigns had been less successful than publicly reported. Most dangerously of all, there were rumors of his involvement in the mysterious death of a neighboring king, rumors that could trigger a war he wasn't prepared to fight. In this context, Philomela's arrival wasn't just a diplomatic courtesy. It was a calculated move in a larger game, one where she was simultaneously pawn and prize, asset and liability. Her value lay not just in what she represented, but in what she might learn, what she might witness, and most importantly, what she might choose to do with that knowledge. The medieval court system was designed to be a theater of power, where every gesture carried meaning, every conversation had multiple layers, and every relationship served political purposes. Nobles spent their lives performing loyalty while plotting betrayal, expressing friendship while gathering intelligence, and maintaining facades that could crumble in an instant if the wrong truth came to light. For someone like Philomela, raised with idealistic notions about honor and truth, this environment was both fascinating and terrifying. She found herself drawn into conversations that seemed innocent on the surface but carried undercurrents of menace. She witnessed interactions that appeared cordial but contained threats that could destroy lives. Most dangerously of all, she began to piece together information that revealed the true nature of the court she had entered. The turning point came during what should have been a routine court ceremony. A visiting ambassador from a neighboring kingdom was presenting gifts and renewing treaties, a standard diplomatic ritual that Philomela had witnessed dozens of times before. But this ceremony was different. The ambassador's words carried coded messages that only someone with Philomela's linguistic training could fully understand. The gifts themselves told a story of military preparations and alliance shifting that painted a very different picture than the one being presented publicly. As Philomela sat in the Great Hall, surrounded by the pageantry and performance of medieval diplomacy, she began to understand that she was witnessing something far more significant than a routine ceremony. She was seeing the careful orchestration of events that would lead to war, betrayal, and the destruction of everything she had been taught to believe about honor and justice. The realization that she possessed dangerous knowledge hit her like a physical blow. In that moment, surrounded by nobles and courtiers who smiled while plotting murder, she understood that her education and idealism had made her not a valuable asset, but a walking liability. She knew too much, understood too clearly, and worst of all, she possessed the moral conviction that might compel her to act on what she had learned. The medieval world had no place for inconvenient truths or moral crusaders who refused to play by the established rules. What happened next would prove that even royal blood offered no protection against the machinery of political necessity, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could possess wasn't a weapon, but a conscience. The weeks following that ceremony passed in a haze of growing dread for Princess Philomela. Every morning brought new revelations, each more damning than the last. She had become an unwilling collector of secrets, a repository of information that could topple kingdoms and destroy lives. The innocent conversations she overheard in hallways revealed military movements. The casual remarks made during meals exposed betrayals that would shock the medieval world. The documents she glimpsed while walking past open doors contained evidence of crimes that would make seasoned warriors weep. But here's what makes Philomela's situation truly horrifying. She wasn't just accumulating dangerous knowledge by accident. King Thrace was deliberately exposing her to it. Every conversation she witnessed, every document she glimpsed, every ceremony she attended had been carefully orchestrated to ensure she would learn exactly what he wanted her to learn. The king wasn't careless with his secrets, he was weaponizing them. Think about the psychological warfare at play here. Thrace understood that Philomela's moral education made her predictable. A princess raised on ideals of justice and truth would inevitably feel compelled to act when confronted with evidence of systematic wrongdoing. He was counting on her conscience to drive her toward exactly the behavior that would justify what he planned to do to her. This wasn't incompetence or oversight. This was entrapment on a scale that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. The king was creating a situation where Philomela would have no choice but to become the threat he needed her to be, providing him with the justification for actions that would otherwise seem monstrously cruel even by medieval standards. The first direct confrontation came during a private dinner in the royal chambers. Philomela, unable to bear the weight of what she had learned, made the fatal mistake of trying to appeal to her sister Procne. She spoke carefully, diplomatically, but her words carried unmistakable implications. She had witnessed evidence of King Thrace planning military actions that would violate existing treaties. She had overheard conversations about eliminating political rivals through methods that could only be described as assassination. Most damning of all, she had seen documents that proved the king's involvement in the death of the neighboring monarch whose demise had triggered the current crisis. Procne's reaction wasn't shock or horror. It was fear. Pure, paralyzing terror that confirmed Philomela's worst suspicions about the true nature of the court she had entered. Her sister didn't deny the accusations. She didn't express outrage or disbelief. Instead, she begged Philomela to forget what she had seen, to pretend ignorance, to understand that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge. But Philomela had been raised to believe that truth was sacred, that justice was paramount, that royal blood carried with it the obligation to protect the innocent and expose the guilty. Everything about her education and moral training compelled her to act on what she had learned. The evidence she possessed could prevent wars, save lives, and bring justice to those who had been wronged. How could she remain silent when speaking could prevent so much suffering? What she didn't understand was that her moral education had been a luxury, a privilege afforded to those who would never be expected to use it in situations where it mattered. Medieval courts operated on principles that had nothing to do with justice or truth. They functioned through carefully maintained balances of terror, mutual blackmail, and the understanding that everyone had secrets worth killing to protect. The conversation with Procne marked the point of no return. Within hours, King Thrace knew exactly what his sister-in-law had said, what she suspected, and most importantly, what she intended to do about it. The network of spies and informants that permeated every aspect of court life ensured that no conversation remained private for long, especially conversations that threatened the king's carefully constructed facade of legitimacy. Thrace's response was swift and decisive. He couldn't allow Philomela to leave the court with the knowledge she possessed. He couldn't risk her sharing what she had learned with allies who might use it against him. But he also couldn't simply have her killed, not without triggering the very international crisis he was trying to avoid. The solution he devised was more creative and infinitely more cruel than simple assassination. Medieval punishment wasn't just about ending threats. It was about sending messages, creating examples that would discourage others from similar acts of defiance. The penalty for possessing dangerous knowledge had to be visible enough to serve as a warning, severe enough to ensure the victim could never again pose a threat, and creative enough to demonstrate the consequences of challenging royal authority. The charges brought against Princess Philomela were masterpieces of medieval legal fiction. Treason, conspiracy, violation of diplomatic immunity, and most creatively corrupting the moral fiber of the court through the spread of malicious rumors. Each charge carried the death penalty, but King Thrace had no intention of executing her. Death would make her a martyr, a symbol of royal injustice that could inspire others to similar acts of defiance. Instead, he chose a punishment that would serve multiple purposes simultaneously. It would neutralize the threat she represented, provide a visible warning to others who might consider similar actions, and satisfy his personal desire for revenge against someone who had dared to challenge his authority. The sentence was delivered in the Great Hall, before an audience of nobles and courtiers who understood exactly what they were witnessing. Princess Philomela would be stripped of her royal titles and privileges. Her property would be confiscated. Her name would be struck from official records. But most significantly, she would lose the ability to ever again speak the truths that had made her so dangerous. The method chosen for this silencing was both practical and symbolic, designed to ensure that her knowledge died with her ability to communicate it. The medieval world had developed sophisticated techniques for dealing with inconvenient witnesses. Simple murder was often too crude, too likely to create martyrs or trigger revenge cycles that could last for generations. Far more effective was the targeted destruction of the victim's ability to threaten the established order while leaving them alive as a warning to others. What happened next in that great hall would become legendary, whispered about in courts across Europe as an example of what awaited those who dared to challenge royal authority with inconvenient truths. The assembled nobles watched in horrified fascination as the machinery of medieval justice prepared to demonstrate the price of speaking truth to power. The executioner who entered the hall wasn't there to take a life. He was there to take something far more precious in medieval society than mere existence. He was there to take away the very thing that made Princess Philomela dangerous, the ability to communicate the knowledge that threatened to topple a kingdom. The tools he carried were designed not for killing, but for a punishment that would leave the victim alive to serve as a permanent reminder of the consequences of defying royal will. Princess Philomela stood before the assembled court, still dressed in the finery befitting her royal status, still possessing the beauty and intelligence that had once made her such a valuable political asset. But in a matter of minutes, all of that would change. The knowledge that had made her dangerous would remain locked in her mind, but her ability to share it with the world would be severed as surely as if it had never existed. The medieval world was about to demonstrate that there were fates worse than death, punishments that could destroy a person's ability to threaten the established order while leaving them alive to suffer the consequences of their defiance. What happened to Princess Philomela in that great hall would echo through history as a reminder that in the game of medieval politics, knowledge was power, silence was survival, and the price of speaking truth could be higher than anyone was prepared to pay. The tools laid out on the executioner's table weren't instruments of death. They were instruments of surgical precision, designed to remove a person's ability to communicate while leaving them conscious, to experience every moment of their transformation from valued princess to living warning. Medieval punishment wasn't just about justice. It was about theater, and this performance was designed to be remembered by every witness for the rest of their lives. The king's physician stood beside the executioner, not to provide mercy, but to ensure the procedure would be carried out with medical precision. They had done this before. The techniques had been refined over generations of political necessity, perfected through trial and error until they could guarantee the victim would survive the ordeal while losing forever, the ability to threaten royal authority through speech. Princess Philomela was forced to kneel on a wooden platform constructed specifically for this purpose. The design elevated her above the crowd, ensuring every noble in the hall could witness what happened to those who possessed inconvenient knowledge. Her hands were bound behind her back, not just to prevent resistance, but to force her into a position of complete vulnerability that emphasized her transformation from powerful royal family member to helpless victim. The first cut was shallow, precise, designed to cause maximum psychological impact rather than immediate physical damage. Medieval executioners understood that the anticipation of pain was often more effective than pain itself in breaking a victim's spirit. They moved slowly, deliberately, allowing Philomela and her audience to contemplate each step of the process that would forever change her relationship with the world around her. But here's what makes this punishment truly diabolical. It wasn't just about silencing Princess Philomela, it was about creating a living symbol that would haunt everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Every time they saw her in the years that followed, they would remember this moment, remember what happened to those who challenged royal authority, remember that knowledge could be more dangerous than any weapon ever forged. The actual procedure took less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes to transform a articulate, intelligent princess into someone who would never again be able to share the secrets that had made her so dangerous. The medieval world had developed this technique specifically for dealing with witnesses who possessed information that could destabilize kingdoms. It was efficient, permanent, and designed to serve as a deterrent that would prevent others from making similar choices. The sound that filled the Great Hall wasn't screaming. Philomela had been raised as royalty, trained from childhood to maintain dignity even in the face of unimaginable circumstances. Instead, the hall filled with a wet, gurgling noise that would haunt the nightmares of everyone present. It was the sound of knowledge being physically severed from the ability to communicate it, the sound of truth being permanently silenced through surgical precision. When it was over, Princess Philomela remained kneeling on the platform, blood streaming down her chin, her eyes wide with shock and pain. But she was alive. That was the point. Death would have made her a martyr. This punishment made her a warning, a living reminder of what awaited those who dared to challenge the established order with inconvenient truths. The physician immediately began treatment designed to ensure she would survive the ordeal. Healing wasn't mercy. It was practical necessity. A dead victim couldn't serve as a long-term deterrent. But a living victim, permanently marked by her defiance, would spend the rest of her life as a walking advertisement for the consequences of possessing dangerous knowledge. King Thrace stood before his assembled court, watching the blood pool on the wooden platform, and delivered a speech that would be remembered by every witness for the rest of their lives. He spoke about loyalty, about the dangers of allowing personal conscience to override political necessity, about the unfortunate fate that awaited those who couldn't understand that some truths were too dangerous to be spoken aloud. His words weren't just directed at the nobles watching the proceedings. They were directed at anyone who might be tempted to follow Philomela's example, anyone who might think their royal blood or moral convictions would protect them from the machinery of political vengeance. The message was clear and unmistakable. Knowledge was power, but power without discretion was suicide. The aftermath of Philomela's punishment rippled through the court like stones thrown into still water. Conversations became more guarded. Nobles who had previously engaged in political gossip fell silent when sensitive topics arose. The very atmosphere of the court changed, becoming more cautious, more fearful, more aware that every word could be the last word they ever spoke freely. But the most profound change was in Princess Procne. Watching her sister's tongue severed had broken something fundamental in the queen's spirit. She understood now that her marriage wasn't a political alliance. It was a hostage situation where she and her family served as guarantees of her home kingdom's cooperation. The sister she had tried to protect through warnings and pleas was now a permanent reminder of her own powerlessness. Medieval courts operated on the principle that fear was more effective than affection in maintaining loyalty. King Thrace had just demonstrated that principle with surgical precision. No one who witnessed Philomela's punishment would ever again mistake royal protection for actual safety. They would understand that their positions, their privileges, even their ability to speak, existed entirely at the king's discretion. The practical implications of Philomela's silencing extended far beyond the immediate shock of the punishment itself. She possessed detailed knowledge of military plans, diplomatic strategies, and political conspiracies that could still prove dangerous if communicated through other means. Medieval courts had to consider the possibility that victims might find alternative ways to share their knowledge, even after being deprived of speech. The The solution was isolation so complete it bordered on imprisonment. Philomela was moved to a tower room, where her contact with the outside world could be carefully monitored and controlled. She was attended by servants who had been selected for their loyalty to the king and their willingness to report any attempts at communication. Even her clothing and personal possessions were searched regularly for hidden messages or coded communications. This wasn't just punishment, it was the systematic erasure of a person's ability to influence the world around them. Philomela could think, remember, and feel, but she could no longer act on any of those internal experiences in ways that might threaten the established order. She had been transformed from an active player in the political game into a passive observer whose knowledge would die with her. The tower where she lived became known throughout the court as the Tower of Silence, a place where inconvenient witnesses were sent to contemplate the consequences of their curiosity. Other nobles would look up at her window and remember what happened to those who learned too much, who saw too clearly, who couldn't understand that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge. But Princess Philomela possessed something that King Thrace hadn't anticipated. Medieval royal education included training in arts and crafts that were considered appropriate for noble women. Embroidery, weaving, tapestry work. Skills that seemed decorative and harmless, designed to occupy idle hands and demonstrate feminine accomplishment. What the king hadn't considered was how these innocent pastimes could become tools of resistance in the hands of someone desperate to communicate. Alone in her tower, surrounded by threads and fabrics intended to keep her occupied with harmless activities, Philomela began to work on something that would prove far more dangerous than any spoken words. She started creating a tapestry that would tell the story of her punishment, reveal the secrets that had led to her silencing, and expose the truth that King Thrace had tried so desperately to suppress. Medieval tapestries weren't just decorative objects. They were complex narratives told through images and symbols that could communicate detailed information to those who knew how to read them. The wealthy and educated of the era were trained from childhood to interpret these visual stories, to understand the coded messages that artists wove into their work. Working with threads and needles that seemed innocent enough to her guards, Philomela began creating a masterpiece of visual storytelling that would prove more dangerous than any speech she might have delivered. Each stitch was placed with careful precision, each color chosen for its symbolic meaning, each scene designed to reveal exactly what she had witnessed in the weeks leading up to her punishment. The tapestry grew slowly, panel by panel, scene by scene, as Philomela poured her knowledge and pain into a medium that no one suspected could be used as a weapon. Her guards saw a silenced princess engaging in appropriate feminine activities. What they failed to recognize was that she was creating the most detailed and damning piece of evidence against King Thrace that had ever existed. The images she wove told the complete story. The secret meetings where military campaigns were planned. The documents that proved the king's involvement in assassination. The diplomatic betrayals that violated every treaty and alliance the kingdom had signed. Most damning of all, the systematic deception that had convinced neighboring kingdoms they were dealing with an honorable ruler rather than a calculating tyrant. Every thread she pulled through the fabric was an act of defiance. Every completed scene of victory against the forces that had tried to silence her permanently. The knowledge that King Thrace had tried to bury was being transformed into a visual narrative that could survive long after she was gone, that could communicate truth even when she could no longer speak it aloud. The irony was perfect and terrible. The king had silenced her voice but left her hands free to work with materials he considered harmless. In trying to prevent her from communicating dangerous knowledge, he had driven her to create something far more permanent and potentially damaging than any conversation could have been. Medieval tapestries were designed to last for centuries, to be passed down through generations as family treasures and historical records. What Philomela was creating wouldn't just expose King Thrace to his contemporaries, it would preserve evidence of his crimes for future generations, ensuring that his reputation would be destroyed long after his death. The completed tapestry would become more than just evidence of royal corruption. It would stand as testament to the human spirit's refusal to be silenced, proof that truth could find a way to survive even the most brutal attempts at suppression. Princess Philomela might have lost her voice, but she was about to give her story, a voice that would echo through history louder than any words she could have spoken. But creating a tapestry of this magnitude wasn't just about artistic skill. It required resources, materials, and most dangerously of all, a way to get the finished work into the hands of someone who could act on the information it contained. Philomela understood that her masterpiece would be worthless if it remained hidden in her tower room, seen only by guards who couldn't read its coded messages or servants too terrified to acknowledge what they witnessed. The solution came through the one person in the castle who still possessed both access to the outside world and reason to help her. Sister Procna, consumed with guilt over her failure to protect Philomela, had been making regular visits to the Tower of Silence. These visits were supposed to be acts of familial comfort, supervised meetings between sisters that demonstrated the king's magnanimous treatment of his silenced prisoner. But Procna's visits served another purpose entirely. Each time she climbed those stone steps, she carried with her a growing understanding of what her husband had done, not just to Philomela, but to the entire political landscape of medieval Europe. The queen had begun to piece together the same information that had doomed her sister, and with each revelation, her loyalty to King Thrace crumbled further. The medieval world operated on the assumption that women, especially royal women, would prioritize family loyalty over political principles. Kings married foreign princesses precisely because they believed blood ties would ensure cooperation between kingdoms. What Thrace hadn't anticipated was that his treatment of Philomela would transform Procna from a compliant political asset into an enemy operating from within his own household. During one of these supervised visits, Philomela managed to show her sister a section of the tapestry. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Procna understood exactly what she was looking at, recognized the coded images that told the story of royal betrayal, assassination, and systematic deception. More importantly, she understood that her sister had created something that could bring down the entire kingdom if it fell into the wrong hands. The realization that struck Procna in that moment was both terrifying and liberating. She possessed the power to destroy her husband, to expose his crimes to the world, to ensure that justice would finally be served for all the innocents who had suffered under his reign. But using that power would require her to sacrifice everything she had built in her years as queen, to abandon the safety and privilege that came with royal status. Medieval queens lived in a paradox of power and powerlessness. They wielded enormous influence within their kingdoms, but remained fundamentally dependent on their husbands for protection, status, and survival itself. A queen who betrayed her king wasn't just committing treason. She was committing suicide, destroying the very foundations of her existence in medieval society. Yet as Procna stared at her sister's blood-stained tapestry, seeing the visual proof of horrors she had tried to ignore, she understood that some betrayals were necessary. Some truths were worth dying for. Some acts of justice required the sacrifice of everything you had built your life around. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Procna would use her position as queen to host a grand feast, a celebration that would bring together nobles from across the kingdom and neighboring realms. The occasion would be carefully chosen to ensure maximum attendance from the very people who needed to see Philomela's evidence. But the feast wouldn't just be a social gathering. It would be a revelation, a moment when the carefully constructed facade of King Thrace's legitimacy would crumble before the eyes of everyone who mattered in medieval European politics. The tapestry would be displayed as if it were merely decorative art, beautiful needlework created by the silenced princess to occupy her time in captivity. Only those with the education to read its coded messages would understand what they were really seeing. The visual narrative would expose every crime, every betrayal, every act of systematic deception that had brought Thrace to power and kept him there. The evidence would be presented not through accusations that could be denied, but through artistic documentation that spoke louder than any testimony. The psychological warfare was perfect. Thrace would be forced to watch as his guests examined his sister-in-law's needlework, slowly realizing what the images represented, gradually understanding that they were looking at proof of crimes that could justify military intervention from multiple kingdoms. He would see the recognition dawn in their eyes. watch his carefully cultivated relationships dissolve as the truth spread through the assembled nobles. Medieval feast preparations took weeks, involving hundreds of servants, elaborate menu planning, and diplomatic communications that reached across national boundaries. Every detail had to be perfect because the success of Procana's plan depended on creating an atmosphere of celebration that would lower everyone's guard just long enough for the truth to take root. The guest list was carefully curated to include exactly the right combination of military leaders, diplomatic representatives, and political rivals who could act on the information they would receive. These weren't random party guests. They were carefully selected individuals who possessed both the power and motivation to respond to evidence of royal corruption with decisive action. King Thrace, unaware of the trap being prepared around him, threw himself into the feast preparations with enthusiasm. He saw the gathering as an opportunity to strengthen his political position, to demonstrate his wealth and power to potential allies and rivals alike. The irony was exquisite. He was funding and organizing the very event that would destroy him. The weeks leading up to the feast were filled with attention that permeated every aspect of court life. Servants whispered in corners about strange activities in the Tower of Silence. Guards reported unusual meetings between the queen and her seamstresses. Nobles noticed changes in Procna's behavior, a new confidence mixed with barely contained fury that suggested something significant was brewing. But the most dramatic change was in Philomela herself. The broken princess who had been silenced and imprisoned was transforming into something far more dangerous than she had ever been when she possessed the ability to speak. Her knowledge, concentrated and refined through months of careful documentation, was about to be unleashed on the medieval world with devastating effect. The completed tapestry was a masterpiece of visual storytelling that revealed the full scope of Thrace's crimes in breathtaking detail. Every panel contained evidence that could justify charges of treason, murder, diplomatic fraud, and systematic violation of the sacred oaths that bound medieval kingdoms together. The artistic skill required to create such a work was impressive, but the courage required to document such dangerous truths was extraordinary. Medieval artists who created political art understood they were risking their lives with every brushstroke, every carved detail, every symbolic representation that challenged royal authority. The difference was that most artists could claim ignorance, could pretend they hadn't understood the implications of their work. Philomela had no such protection. Her tapestry was a deliberate act of resistance, a calculated decision to expose truth regardless of personal consequences. The final panels of the tapestry showed not just historical crimes, but ongoing conspiracies that threatened the stability of multiple kingdoms. Military buildups disguised as defensive preparations. Diplomatic negotiations conducted in bad faith while secret alliances were being forged with enemy nations. Plans for assassinations that would remove political rivals and clear the path for territorial expansion. This wasn't just evidence of past wrongdoing, it was a preview of future catastrophes that could still be prevented if the right people acted on the information they were about to receive. The tapestry transformed Philomela from a victim of royal injustice into a prophet, warning of disasters that could reshape the medieval world. The night before the feast, Procna made her final visit to the Tower of Silence. The sisters spent hours together, not speaking because one of them couldn't, but communicating through glances, gestures, and the shared understanding that comes from facing impossible choices together. They both knew this might be their last night alive. They both understood that what they were about to do would trigger consequences neither of them could control. Medieval justice moved swiftly when royal authority was challenged. Kings who felt threatened didn't conduct lengthy trials or careful investigations. They acted with brutal efficiency to eliminate threats before they could spread. Procne and Philomela were about to discover whether truth was powerful enough to survive the immediate violent response their revelations would certainly provoke. The morning of the feast dawned clear and cold, perfect weather for the kind of outdoor festivities that would display the tapestry to maximum advantage. Servants began arriving before sunrise to prepare the Great Hall, to set up the elaborate displays that would showcase the kingdom's wealth and power. Hidden among the decorative elements positioned where it would be clearly visible to every guest, was the most dangerous piece of art ever created in medieval Europe. The first guests began arriving at midday, traveling from kingdoms across the continent to attend what they believed would be a routine diplomatic celebration. They came expecting good food, political networking, and the kind of ceremonial pageantry that characterized medieval court life. What they were about to witness would shatter their understanding of the political landscape and force them to choose sides in a conflict that would determine the fate of nations. King Tereus greeted his guests with the confidence of a man who believed he had successfully buried every threat to his authority. He had silenced the most dangerous witness to his crimes. He had isolated the knowledge that could destroy him. He had transformed potential enemies into voiceless victims who posed no threat to his carefully constructed empire. How wrong he was about to discover he had been. The feast began with all the ceremony and grandeur befitting a royal celebration. Musicians played, servants poured wine, and nobles engaged in the elaborate social rituals that characterized medieval court life. The atmosphere was festive, relaxed, perfect for the kind of casual conversation that would allow dangerous information to spread naturally through the assembled crowd. It was only when the guests began to examine the decorative tapestries adorning the Great Hall that the mood began to shift. One by one, educated nobles who possessed the skills to read visual narratives started to understand what they were seeing. The recognition spread like wildfire through the crowd as each person who understood the tapestry's message began to point out details to their neighbors. The transformation of the feast from celebration to revelation happened with startling speed. Within minutes, every guest in the hall was staring at Philomela's masterpiece, reading the visual testimony that exposed decades of royal corruption in devastating detail. The evidence was undeniable, the implications staggering, the call to action unmistakable. King Tereus watched his world crumble in real time as the truth he had tried so desperately to suppress spread through the assembled representatives of medieval European power. The knowledge he had thought safely buried in the mind of a silenced princess was being shouted from the walls of his own great hall, preserved in threads and needles that would outlast any spoken testimony. The medieval world was about to learn that some truths are too powerful to be silenced, that knowledge can find ways to survive even the most brutal attempts at suppression, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon against tyranny isn't a sword or an army, but the patient work of hands that refuse to be stilled, even when voices have been forever silenced. The feast that was supposed to celebrate King Tereus' power had become the stage for his destruction, and the princess who had lost her tongue was about to have the last word after all. The silence that followed was deafening, not the comfortable quiet of a satisfied dinner crowd, but the electric hush of a world shifting on its axis. Noble after noble set down their wine cups, their faces pale as they absorbed what the tapestry revealed. The visual testimony spread through the crowd like plague, each person who understood becoming a carrier of knowledge that would reshape kingdoms. King Tereus stood frozen at the head of the Great Hall, watching decades of careful planning dissolve before his eyes. The tapestry he had dismissed as harmless women's work was destroying him more thoroughly than any army ever could. Every thread Philomela had pulled through that fabric was pulling apart the foundations of his reign. But here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. The assembled nobles weren't just witnessing the exposure of one tyrant's crimes. They were seeing proof that the entire medieval political system was built on lies, that the divine right of kings was nothing more than elaborate theater. That royal authority existed only as long as subjects agreed to pretend it was legitimate. The Duke of Saxony was the first to speak, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "Your Majesty," he said, his words dripping with newly discovered contempt. "Perhaps you could explain these rather interesting decorations." The emphasis on decorations made it clear he understood exactly what he was looking at. Other voices joined in, a chorus of accusations disguised as polite inquiries. The ambassador from France wanted clarification about certain military movements depicted in the needlework. The papal representative questioned images that appeared to show violations of church sanctuary. The English delegation demanded explanations for scenes that suggested treaty violations of the most serious kind. Thrace tried to maintain his composure to dismiss the tapestry as the fevered imaginings of a traumatized woman. But medieval nobles weren't fools. They could read the coded language of visual narrative as easily as they could read Latin. The evidence wasn't ambiguous or open to interpretation. It was detailed, specific, and damning beyond any possibility of denial. The psychological pressure in that hall was crushing. Thrace found himself surrounded by men who had come as guests and were rapidly transforming into judges. The feast had become a trial, and the defendant was running out of options. He could feel the political alliances that had taken decades to build crumbling around him like sandcastles at high tide. Queen Procne watched from her position at the high table, her face a mask of royal composure that concealed the satisfaction burning in her chest. She had gambled everything on this moment, and the gamble was paying off beyond her wildest hopes. The evidence her sister had created was speaking louder than any testimony could have. But the real genius of Philomela's tapestry wasn't just its content, it was its permanence. Spoken accusations could be denied, witnesses could be silenced, documents could be destroyed. But this tapestry would survive. It would be copied, studied, preserved as evidence for generations to come. The truth it contained would outlive everyone in that hall. The medieval world operated on reputation and perceived legitimacy. A king whose crimes were exposed in such dramatic fashion couldn't simply apologize and continue ruling. The damage to his authority was immediate and irreversible. Every noble in that hall was already calculating how to distance themselves from a monarch whose reign was clearly ending. The first to leave was the Venetian trade delegation. They simply stood up, bowed politely, and walked out without explanation. Their departure triggered an exodus as other guests realized they needed to be elsewhere when the inevitable violence began. Medieval politics didn't end with embarrassing revelations. It ended with blood. Within an hour, the Great Hall was nearly empty. The foreign dignitaries had fled to their lodgings to compose urgent messages to their home governments. The domestic nobles had retreated to their estates to assess their positions and prepare for civil war. The servants had vanished into the shadows, understanding that loyalty to a doomed king was its own form of suicide. King Thrace stood alone in his great hall, surrounded by the evidence of his own destruction. The tapestry that had seemed so harmless hung on the walls like a death sentence, its images more damaging than any enemy army. He had been defeated not by superior force or political maneuvering, but by the patient work of a silenced woman who had refused to let truth die with her voice. The immediate aftermath was swift and brutal. By morning, 3 neighboring kingdoms had declared war. The Pope had issued a bull condemning Thrace as an enemy of Christendom. His own nobles were in open revolt, rallying behind various claimants to his throne. The political earthquake that began with a feast had become a continental catastrophe. But what happened to the sisters who had triggered this avalanche of consequences? Medieval justice didn't distinguish between justified and unjustified rebellion. Queens who betrayed their husbands faced the same fate as common traitors, regardless of their motivations or the righteousness of their cause. Procne's end came quickly. Thrace, driven mad by the collapse of everything he had built, killed her in a rage that was part fury and part desperation. The woman who had been his queen, his political ally, the mother of his heir, became the first casualty of the war her sister's tapestry had started. Philomela's fate was both crueler and more poetic. Thrace ordered her thrown from the tower window, a death that would appear accidental while satisfying his need for revenge. But as she fell through the cold morning air, something extraordinary happened. The medieval chroniclers who recorded this story claimed she was transformed. That divine intervention saved her from her tormentor's final act of vengeance. Whether you believe in miraculous transformations or prefer more rational explanations, the truth is that Philomela's story didn't end with her death. It spread across Europe like wildfire, growing with each telling until it became legend. The princess who had lost her tongue became the voice of everyone who had ever been silenced by power, everyone who had ever possessed dangerous knowledge, everyone who had ever faced the choice between safety and truth. The tapestry itself survived the wars that followed, passed from hand to hand by those who understood its historical significance. Copies were made, details were preserved, and the visual testimony that had brought down a kingdom became a permanent part of the historical record. Medieval chroniclers wrote extensively about the feast where truth finally spoke louder than power. But here's what makes Philomela's story truly timeless. The methods have evolved, but the fundamental conflict remains unchanged. Powerful people still try to silence inconvenient witnesses. Dangerous knowledge still threatens established orders. The choice between speaking truth and preserving safety still confronts people in every generation. Modern whistleblowers face sophisticated campaigns of character assassination rather than physical mutilation. Contemporary dissidents are destroyed through legal warfare and social media campaigns rather than public executions. But the underlying dynamic remains constant. Those who threaten power structures with inconvenient truths will face consequences designed to deter others from similar acts of courage. What Philomela understood, what every person who has ever chosen truth over safety has understood, is that some knowledge carries moral obligations that transcend personal survival. When you witness systematic injustice, when you possess evidence of crimes against innocent people, when you have the power to prevent future suffering by exposing present corruption, silence becomes complicity. The medieval world that destroyed Princess Philomela for speaking truth was a world where might made right, where royal blood justified any atrocity, where the powerful could commit any crime as long as they could silence the witnesses. But it was also a world where a silenced woman could bring down a kingdom with nothing but needle and thread, where truth could survive even the most brutal attempts at suppression, where justice could emerge from the most unlikely sources. Today we live in a world with international courts, constitutional protections, and legal frameworks designed to protect those who expose wrongdoing. We have formal whistleblower protections, investigative journalism, and democratic institutions that theoretically provide channels for addressing corruption without requiring personal martyrdom. Yet, Princess Philomela's story remains relevant because the powerful still prefer compliant silence to inconvenient truth. Corporate executives still destroy the careers of employees who expose illegal practices. Government officials still prosecute those who reveal classified evidence of wrongdoing. Religious leaders still protect institutions rather than victims. The weapons have changed, but the war between truth and power continues. What we can learn from Philomela's courage is that truth has a power that transcends individual mortality. The knowledge she died to preserve outlived everyone who tried to suppress it. The justice she couldn't achieve in life was realized through the permanent record she created. The voice they stole from her spoke through her art for centuries after her death. The medieval world teaches us that privacy is a luxury, that safety is temporary, and that the most dangerous thing you can possess isn't a weapon, but a conscience. Princess Philomela discovered all of these truths the hard way, and her story serves as both warning and inspiration for anyone who faces similar choices. Her tapestry reminds us that truth can be preserved in unexpected ways, that creativity can overcome censorship, that patient documentation can be more powerful than immediate action. Sometimes the pen really is mightier than the sword, even when the pen is a needle and the paper is cloth. The princess who had her tongue ripped out for revealing a secret ultimately spoke louder than anyone else in medieval Europe. Her silence became the most eloquent testimony against tyranny ever recorded. Her story proves that truth, like energy, can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed from one form into another. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. In a world where power structures still try to silence inconvenient voices, where dangerous knowledge still threatens established orders, where the choice between truth and safety still confronts each of us, Princess Philomela's story reminds us that truth will find a way. It always has. It always will. The only question is whether we'll have the courage to help it along the way.